Morning, SUMPS. So here's the deal. We've got a few options. I take it this is your first time. Yes, we've never done this before. Well, that's no problem. Remind me, how many of you are there? 6 of us, 3 guys and 3 girls. Great, that's just enough to take all the ATVs. He digressed from the topic for a moment. Judging by his voice, the man seemed to be of a decent age. You mentioned options? Oh, right. So, there are 3 routes. The first one is fairly easy, the second is more challenging, and the third, well, you can imagine. Steep hills, mud, and all that. Since it's your first time, I'd recommend starting with the first. If you like it, you can always come back and try the others. Yes, I think that makes sense. And could you remind me of the cost? $200 per ATV. Are they 2-seaters? Absolutely. Usually young folks go in pairs. Girls aren't too eager to take the wheel themselves, he chuckled. Perfect. Could you book us for tomorrow, preferably in the first half of the day? Got you all set. Will 1 p.m. work? Yes, that's great. Thank you so much. See you then. The conversation ended with short beeps, and without wasting any time, I wrote in our group chat on WhatsApp. Here's the card number. You can send the money now. We'd been thinking about going on a trip for a while, spending some quality time outdoors, breathing fresh air. But the usual stuff, barbecues, tents, and booze, was getting old. We wanted to spend this weekend differently. By 1 p.m. the next day, our lively group was already standing at the gate of a garage cooperative, the name of which I can't even remember anymore. I may have been a bit hasty in assuming the phone guy was older. When we met him, he turned out to be a man of about 40, maybe a little more. He greeted us at the same gate. "You're here to ride, right?" "You got it," my friend Larry replied with a grin. "All right, follow me." The man walked around the security booth, waved at the guard, and headed down a long corridor lined with endless garage doors. Naturally, we followed. Jangling a set of keys, he stopped at a rather weathered garage door, slid a key into the lock, and opened it with a long, creaky effort. Inside, the garage turned out to be surprisingly spacious, though packed with all sorts of car junk. Among the clutter stood 3 shiny 4-wheelers. The man carefully rolled each of them outside while we shivered in the biting autumn wind. "All right, kids," he called to us as he carried out a sizable box filled with protective gear. "Goggles are mandatory. Twigs, branches, you get the idea? Don't want anyone losing an eye, or we'll all be searching for it together. The rest of the gear is optional, but I'd recommend it. The route's likely pretty muddy. Your clothes will get dirty, and you'll have to clean it later." We suited up as required, laughing at how ridiculous we looked in full gear. Once everyone picked a quad bike, the guys hopped into the driver's seats while the girls climbed on behind them. "All right, a quick briefing," the man said, standing in front of us. "Stick together, one after another, and keep your distance. The trail is probably very muddy after the rain. If someone gets stuck, which mind you shouldn't happen, don't panic. I'll come back and handle it." "You're coming with us?" I asked. "Of course. Otherwise you might decide to ride this straight home," he joked. "Or worse, something bad might happen." "Makes sense," I muttered under my breath. He spent a few more minutes explaining how to handle the ATVs, what to do, and what to avoid. Finally, about 20 minutes later, we started the engines and followed the instructor one by one. The first thing that greeted us as we left the garage cooperative was a massive puddle. It promptly drenched my sneakers with cold, muddy water within seconds. Then the indescribable beauty began. Fields gave way to groves and then back again. The sky was breathtaking, with beams of sunlight fighting their way through dark gray clouds. The grass had dried up, and fallen leaves blanketed the puddles and mud beneath, just as the instructor had warned. Speaking of him, I still don't know his name. To be honest, driving this contraption for the first time was pretty challenging for me. The ATV kept sliding in the ruts, causing my wife, who was sitting behind me, to squeal in alarm. Every time we approached another muddy puddle, steep incline, or sharp descent, I'd hear her trembling voice utter her catchphrase, "All right, time to be scared." It was hilarious. The girls were screaming and filming everything on their phones, while we guys laughed and whooped like kids. Covered in mud up to our waists, we finally arrived at our first stop, a gorgeous clearing in the midst of the golden autumn forest. As we took a break, snapping photos and catching our breath, the instructor approached us. "All right, folks, next we'll be passing some sumps. They're these peculiar ponds where wastewater used to be drained from sewers and factories. Well, used to be anyway. They've been abandoned for years, but the water's still there. Now, why am I telling you this? Keep an eye on the road. Sometimes moose wander into the area to bathe." "Wow," Vivian exclaimed. "Do they show up often?" "Oh, quite often. We might even see one." "All right, break's over. Let's keep moving. The clock's ticking," the instructor concluded. We sat on the ATVs again, started them up, and continued to follow him. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, after passing through the beautiful forest, we arrived at a cluster of small ponds. There were several of them, and, well, they didn't look great. "Heads up, folks, it might stink a bit. This water's been sitting here for years, so don't be alarmed. And remember, don't stray from the path," the instructor reminded us. It was obvious. The water was a murky green, littered with garbage. Old tires and fallen trees lined the shores, making the sight rather unpleasant. We passed one pond, then another. As I drove, I alternated between watching the road and glancing at the ponds. Suddenly, something caught my attention. On the opposite bank of one of the ponds, it seemed like someone was sitting among the reeds near the water. I clearly saw a figure. My first thought, a fisherman maybe. Even in places like this, people sometimes fish. Then again, how do they eat the catch? Perhaps they just release it for the thrill. To avoid holding up our group, I chose not to dwell on what I had seen. Without getting a clear look, I refocused on the road and accelerated a bit to catch up with the others, as I had fallen behind. "Who did you see back there?" my wife asked from behind. "Probably a fisherman sitting by the far pond," she murmured, gripping me tighter as a steep downhill slope came into view, with a massive puddle waiting at the bottom. The instructor came to a stop. One by one, the ATVs halted behind him. First the lead vehicle, then the second, and finally ours. "All right, listen up. I'm going to head down first. Then I'll come back up and show you how to handle the descent," he said. My wife tensed, pressing closer to me. The instructor hopped onto his ATV and smoothly descended the hill. The dense trees blocked our view of him, but we could still hear the hum of the engine. Yet, despite the noise, there was no sign of him or his ATV. We waited. 1 minute passed, then 2. Still nothing. "Hey, what's going on up there?" I called out to the group ahead. "He hasn't come back yet," Kevin's voice responded. "It's been at least 3 minutes. Is he okay down there?" Larry chimed in. I moved closer to the others. "Maybe he didn't land the descent properly," Kate muttered. "I don't know. Should we check?" I replied. Cutting the engine, I dismounted from my ATV and cautiously began walking down the slope. At the bottom, I froze. His ATV was there, but the instructor was nowhere to be seen. He had vanished. "Hey guys!" I yelled. "What's going on?" Multiple voices called back. "He's not here." "What do you mean he's not there?" Kevin was the next to descend, followed by the rest of the group, one by one. Where could he have gone? Larry scratched his head. "Maybe he went off to, take care of business," Kate suggested with a shrug. "Well, he could have at least warned us or something. Call him. His number should be in your phone," Josie, my wife, suggested. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. It was naive to think there would be any cell reception in a remote place like this. Sure enough, neither I nor my friends had any signal. "What do we do now?" Viv asked nervously. She was one of those people who would immediately panic at the first sign of trouble. Her trembling voice and darting eyes gave her away. "Let's wait a little longer. Maybe he'll show up." We agreed on that. Turning off our ATVs, we waited. 10 minutes, 20, 30, but no one came. "Guys, I really don't like this," my wife blurted out. "Neither do I," Kate chimed in. "Honestly, I don't think he's coming back," Kevin added, further fueling the unease. It was already 3:30 in the afternoon, late autumn. darkness would start creeping in soon. The guys and I decided to search the surrounding area for the missing instructor, staying within sight of each other, but there was no trace of him. Not a single footprint, not a clue. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. To be honest, I was starting to feel uneasy myself. The sun was sinking lower, and we were stranded in the middle of the woods, far from civilization, with no signal, no food, and no water. After about an hour of fruitless searching, it became noticeably colder as evening approached, and we all began to feel it. "All right, folks, what's the plan now? Anyone have any bright ideas?" I asked. "Does anyone remember the way back?" Kate suggested. "Let's head back. Maybe we'll get reception and call the police. They'll figure out what to do." "Sounds like a plan," Josie agreed. Vivian just stayed quiet. We settled on that course of action. As night began to fall, we turned on our headlights, started our ATVs, and began retracing our path. Before long, we reached the familiar waste ponds, their pungent stench assaulting our noses once more. "I hope we have enough fuel to make it back," Josie murmured behind me. We should. We were supposed to return anyway, with or without the instructor. Everyone was on edge now. No one was shouting, laughing, or recording videos anymore. All we wanted was to get back to where we had started and call the police. Little did we know, the true nightmare was still waiting for us up ahead. We passed the first settling pond, approaching the second. I'm not sure if I mentioned it before, but we had to drive right along the edge of the body of water. On our right, there were fields and sparse tree plantations, and on the left, a small cliff leading down to the water. As we passed this cliff, something caught my attention. The most terrifying thoughts that had been lurking deep in my mind suddenly surfaced. I didn't even need to go down there to understand what had happened. "Guys, stop!" I shouted, and immediately pressed the horn button. Everyone stopped. I got off the ATV and turned on the flashlight on my phone. The sight below, right by the water, made me step back. On the shore lay our instructor. I recognized him by the bright red jacket he was wearing. We, the guys, descended to take a closer look. The girls stayed on their ATVs, but from their reactions, I could tell they realized what had happened, even though they hadn't seen what we saw. Once we reached the water, we found the lifeless body of the instructor. He was lying in a puddle of blood, water, and mud, face down. "Maybe he's still alive? Maybe we can help him," Larry shouted. "I doubt it," Kevin replied. "But we need to flip him over anyway." "How did he even end up here? How long have we been driving since that slope?" "I don't know. Maybe 40 minutes. This is messed up. All right, let's try turning him on his back." We carefully pulled the body a little farther from the water and turned him over. At the sight, Larry screamed and fell on his backside. Kevin covered his mouth with his hand, and I just froze, like a statue, losing my ability to speak. The poor guy's body had been gutted. His stomach was open, ribs spread apart, and everything inside him had been pulled out, replaced with a mess of dirt, leaves, and reeds. "Guys, we need to get the hell out of here. As fast as we can," Kevin said, not taking his eyes off the poor guy. Immediately, we climbed back up the slope and sat back on the ATVs. As soon as we started the engines, a howl rang out from the opposite side of the settling pond. A long, sharp, piercing howl. "Are those wolves? Are there wolves here?" Josie panicked. I don't know, but I doubt that it's wolves," I answered, feeling cold sweat running down my back. "Then what is it?" Josie almost whispered, her voice trembling. "I have no idea, but I have an awful feeling." "Well, let's hurry up. Why are we standing still?" I shouted irritably, trying to hide the growing anxiety. The engines roared to life and we rushed to go. Panic was gradually overtaking common sense. Because of this, the ATVs occasionally veered off the path or got stuck in the mud. My mind was consumed with questions. Who could have done this to the instructor? And most importantly, why stuff his body with swamp debris like a straw scarecrow? A new wave of horror and confusion hit me, and the others when, as we drove through a small grove, a few cold drops fell onto my face. I stopped, and the others did too. "It's blood!" Josie screamed, almost hysterical. Without saying a word, we all looked up. At that moment, a horrifying female scream echoed, and no wonder, above us, hung on broken branches of trees, was the same instructor's body, and just a few seconds later, from the direction of the settling ponds, came a reply. Another piercing, sharp howl, sending shivers down my spine, making my insides clench. Without thinking, we hastily moved forward, not stopping anymore. Only after a few minutes, passing through the grove, did I begin to look around, and suddenly realized this wasn't the road we were on earlier. Somewhere, we had taken a wrong turn. Shit, I muttered, pressing the horn. Everyone stopped. Are you even paying attention to where you're going? I yelled in frustration, unable to contain my anger. This isn't the road. We're going the wrong way. Who cares? Let's just go anywhere. We need to get out of here, Vivian shouted, wiping away her tears. Is your gas tank endless? Well, in that case, sure, we can keep going, I snapped back. Enough arguing, Larry shouted. We missed the turn. We need to go back. We haven't gone too far. We turned back and headed toward the grove. As we entered it, the first ATV suddenly stopped sharply, then the second, and the third. What's going on? I leaned sideways to see what happened, and then I froze. The light from the first ATV's headlight caught a silhouette in the darkness. A silhouette that made me freeze in place, paralyzed by uncontrollable horror. My muscles refused to move, and my gaze seemed glued to whatever was in the bushes. There, in the grove, stood something truly terrifying and incomprehensible. It wasn't at all disturbed by the bright headlights shining directly in its face, if that could even be called a face. Many have probably seen the infamous photo that circulated on the internet. It depicted some creature supposedly captured by a trail camera, unnaturally thin, with glowing eyes. I think they called it Rake, but everyone quickly realized it was a fake, created by a skilled person in Photoshop. But what stood in the bushes before us now was no fake. The creature from that image had seemingly come to life. Its eyes glowed, reflecting the light from the headlights. It stood upright, completely covered in moss and mud from head to toe. Its skin was wrinkled, like a drowned corpse that had been pulled from the water after weeks. The staring lasted only a moment. Suddenly, the creature lunged in our direction. We immediately snapped out of our shock and tried to turn around, but the mud had done its job. The first ATV slid off the road and got stuck. Kevin was about to jump off and leap onto another ATV, but before he could take a step, the creature attacked him from behind. An inhuman, piercing scream echoed throughout the area. Blood gushed from his neck and poured onto the ground. The creature sank its teeth into Kevin's neck without stopping. My friend's body collapsed into the mud, and we couldn't do anything to help. Vivian screamed so loudly that she didn't even hear us shouting at her to get on one of the ATVs. It was as if she didn't notice us. In less than a second, another creature appeared from the forest, charging toward us at full speed. It lunged at Vivian, knocked her to the ground. With its thin, sharp limbs, it pierced her ribcage, breaking her ribs and ripping everything inside her out. The girl choked on her own blood, while the creature continued to tear her apart like a rag doll. This hell lasted only a few seconds. It was only when I heard Larry's ATV revving that I snapped back to reality. We tried to turn around. I pushed the throttle to the maximum. The mud flew in all directions, and finally, we managed to get out of that mess and head in the opposite direction. As I turned around, I saw several more creatures, crawling on all fours like animals, running out of the grove and joining their kin. My heart felt like it was about to fall out of my chest and into the mud, and my trembling, fear-stricken hands kept trying to turn the handlebars in the wrong direction. But I held on with all my strength. Thank God, just before we reached the holding ponds, we seemed to have found the right turn. Larry was racing at full speed, bouncing over the bumps, struggling to keep his balance on the turns. Of course, after everything we had seen, no one was really paying attention to the road anymore. I wasn't sure if we were going the right way or not. The darkness had already descended over us. Beyond the headlights, we couldn't see a thing. Not far from the same holding ponds, the familiar creature crossed our path. It darted from one bush to another, right in front of the ATV. "They're chasing us!" my wife screamed. I tried to calm her down, telling her everything would be fine, that we would make it out and be home today, although honestly, I was struggling to believe that myself. I fell a little behind Larry. My ATV began to sputter, as if the fuel was about to run out. And then, a sudden blow from the right. A quick, pale silhouette darted into the forest. The ATV, though heavy, nearly tipped over. The creature was strong enough to try to flip it. Luckily, my wife and I had distributed our weight properly, and the vehicle stayed upright. I quickly shifted gears and tried to accelerate, not realizing I was in a puddle. The wheels sank deeper into the mud, and I had only made the situation worse. Primal fear gripped me when I saw that familiar silhouette in the bushes again. I couldn't hear Larry anymore. He probably didn't even realize I was stuck. The creature lunged at us, followed by a second and third. They surrounded us, snarling and baring their teeth like some unknown beasts. "Hold on tight. Do you hear me?" I ordered my wife. The first creature got closer to the ATV. I swung with all my might and hit it in the head. Fortunately, the knuckles of my gloves had tough plastic inserts. The creature immediately fell into the puddle, and the others were already crawling toward us. By some twist of fate, when I hit it, it fell directly under the ATV's wheels. The wheels got caught on it, and I immediately knew what to do. Grabbing the throttle, I twisted it to the maximum. The ATV practically leaped out of the puddle. "Hold on tight! Do you hear me?" I shouted at my wife, who had already clung to me with all her remaining strength. We quickly drove out of the forest plantation. Once we were in the open field, I noticed a stationary light about 200 meters ahead. "That's Larry! They're there!" I shouted and steered the ATV in that direction. But alas, when we arrived, the guys weren't there. Only the ATV was left, with no trace of them. Of course, we didn't stop. Once we reached the dirt road, we sped away from the area. I knew this road well by now. Behind us, the same long, drawn-out howl was heard several times, but it was already far away. After another 40 minutes, we finally saw the lights of street lamps in the garage cooperative in the distance. A few dozen meters before reaching them, we had to abandon the ATV and continue on foot to the garages. It was so terrifying that my legs were shaking, and it felt like all the strength had drained from my body. Horrifying scenes from about an hour ago kept flashing before my eyes. Finally, the huge puddle and the rusty old gates appeared. Once we were behind the fence, I felt safe for the first time that night. Josie seemed to calm down a little too. Sitting under the streetlight, we lit cigarettes. "We should call the police," she sighed. "We should," I replied, inhaling the bitter smoke. The police car arrived half an hour later. During that time, we sat under the light, completely exhausted and terrified. While we waited for the officers, we came up with a story. Of course, no one was going to mention any creatures or monsters. We just said that we had fallen behind, then got lost. There was no signal, so we asked for help finding our friends. But no one found our friends. In fact, they didn't even find their bodies, just the ATVs covered in mud. About a week later, their bodies surfaced in the same swamp of the holding pond. A fisherman called the police, reporting a horrific find. I've sifted through a lot of information about that place, and you know what? I can say for sure, this wasn't the first time people had disappeared without a trace in that area. Abandoned motorcycles and cars had been found there, and fishermen who went to the holding ponds had also turned up in those waters. But nowhere had it been written about what lurks there. It seems we're the only ones who made it out of that hell. And here's what keeps me up at night. What was dumped into those holding ponds that gave rise to such creatures?